All right. Well, thank you so much for you guys for tuning in to the first of the workshop series presented by the Inclusive Internship Project. Today I'm going to give you best tips and practices on how to write a letter of recommendation. We'll also go through some examples. There'll be time for us to kind of go through speaking to each other about what we think looks good and looks bad in some examples I give, as well as I'll go through structure and other things like that. Um, I did want to start off with having just this slide here. I know that you three know me already as being part of the Inclusive Internship Project. However, we are hoping to use this as a tool with other staff and faculty on our campus and beyond. So here's a little intro to me to those that may not know me. I'm Rochelle Caston. I'm the Inclusive Internship Project Coordinator here at Edgewood College, and my contact information is rcaston@edgewood.edu. All right, so I like to start off anything I do with a presentation or a webinar, of course, with the outline so you know what to expect during the time that we have together. So first I'm going to go over the learning objectives of the workshop. I did present those in other areas, such as in the email and the invite on here, but we'll just go over those again in the case you haven't had the opportunity to look over those. Next, I'm going to answer the question of what is a letter of recommendation? I know everyone will be coming in here from a different standpoint of what they do and don't know about the letter of recommendation, so I want to be sure to cover all the bases. And, when you are asked to write a letter of recommendation, what are those next steps? Now what? After we talk about how to prep yourself in the now what section, I'll go through the structure of a letter of recommendation, which will be pretty basic along the lines of the beginning, middle, and outro paragraphs. And I'm going to open up two areas for questions and wrap up. So in section 5, I'll do a little wrap up to kind of culminate what we learned, as well as some potential next steps you can take if you'd like, as well as open it up for questions. And in the case someone needs to pop out because I know we're in the middle of our workday, things come up, this will kind of be a natural pause. Otherwise, if you are able to stick around, I'll have 4 examples for us to go through and to discuss whether or not we think they're good or bad examples, and then what we might change about the bad ones. Finally, in the case after this session that we have together, you would like more information or would like to check on what I used for the information in this webinar, then I have provided a list of my references, and of course, last but not least, my contact information and a big thank you at the end. All right, so first we're going to talk about the learning objectives. By the end of this workshop, you will have learned what a letter of recommendation is and why they are important, how to best set yourself up for success when writing a letter of recommendation, basic requirements of a letter of recommendation, and then of course the best tips and practices that I can give you at this time of how to write those if you haven't done it before or if you're looking to improve what you've already done in the past. So first, what is a letter of recommendation? Well, much like a resume or a cover letter, a letter of recommendation is a professional document, and it's one of those ones where instead of you writing about yourself, you're writing about another individual. So really, it's a means to see a student or someone else as described by someone else or their point of view. Because a letter of recommendation will typically be for something along the lines of a full-time position someone's applying for, you know, secondary, post-secondary or graduate school, sometimes even PhDs or special programs, what you're going to want to do is you're highlighting a specific skill set of that individual pertaining to the position that they're applying for. So much like it's stated here, the main objective is to highlight the student's qualifications in relation to the specific position or program they're applying for. Ultimately, the biggest rule of thumb is that when you're writing this letter, you're providing a character witness to somebody else on the student's behalf. So I know I've mentioned that I've used the words individual and students. I guess I'm just going to backtrack a little bit right here. When it comes to type of recommendations, there's many reasons as to why you might be providing a letter of recommendation. But these are kind of the 3 main categories which someone's going to come to you to. And I will say now, as I seem to have forgot to preface before, a lot of the things we're going to be talking about are in the lens of college interns, which are the population that I work with you guys with here in the Inclusive Internship Project. However, I know a lot of you work with younger volunteers, maybe you have some longtime staff or faculty that are looking to move on to different positions. Letter of recommendations can be for anyone and everyone. but again, I'll kind of tailor this around students. So jumping back into the types of recommendations, the biggest ones you're going to see coming from college students, especially your interns, are for when they want to go into the full-time or part-time workforce during or after college, or just other internships in general. You'll also see a lot of students asking for letters of recommendations for colleges and universities, such as grad school, or for that younger population that might be volunteering with you, especially if they're high schoolers, maybe a letter of recommendation to get into their preferred college. And another larger type of letter of recommendation will be for those in specialized or specific programs. So these are things like AmeriCorps or Peace Corps, specific certifications the individual wants to get. There really is no limit on what it could be for, but these are typically where we see students asking for letter of recommendations on behalf of someone that they trust to give them a good review. So, in the case that you have been asked to give a letter of recommendation, whether you have in the past before or you're just waiting for that to happen one of these days, the next biggest question is always like, well, I've been asked to write one, now what? First and foremost, before you say yes or no to a student, you should really give a pause to yourself and tell the student you'll get back to them, because you want to reflect internally and think, first, do I feel I could accurately represent the student through this letter? You have to really think the position that you've been in with that student and how you've worked with them, and your ability to be able to give a raving review for this position or university that they really want to get into. As well as asking yourself, do you even have the personal time or capacity you need to put into the letter of recommendation? When I get into the structure, you'll see that it isn't just necessarily something you can whip together in a matter of half a day, whatever that might look like, because you want to tailor the letter of recommendation to each student that you do. The biggest no-no out of a letter of recommendation is having a template that you use where you just input the student's name and like if they're an intern with you or a student, whatever that might be, because you never know if the student's going to take that letter and be applying to the same type of programs as different students. And there are definitely hiring boards and search committees that do see those repetitions of, Jane and Joe both sent the same letter of recommendation from the same person, which has the same wording. So that definitely does not look good on you or the student in that case. So ultimately, like I said, when you've been asked, it is okay to say no to a request, especially if you feel like you can't accurately represent the student, or if you don't know them well enough that you feel like this is in your capacity, or also if it is just a time restriction. The student will have to understand that a request is a request, doesn't mean it has to be fulfilled, but we've seen in the past that students typically ask individuals that they know would be able to give them a good review, as well as hopefully be able to carve out the time to really help them move forward in their goals. So, in the off chance that you say yes, here are just a couple things that are great to have on hand to get ready for what you are going to do and what you're going to write in a letter of recommendation. So the two biggest things you're going to want before you start writing the letter of recommendation are going to be the student's resume and then a description of the position or program that they're applying to. For the student's resume, it's great. So you'll know the student in the capacity that you work with them, whether it's an internship, a full-time job, whatever that might be. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that you know everything that the student does or the overall picture of the student with their experiences. And it's good to have the resume to kind of, compare like how is the student done with me versus what they've done in other positions, as well as you're not going to want to write what is on the student's resume in the letter of recommendation. And I'll go a little bit more into that later, but basically you don't want to be repetitive. So the letter of recommendation is going to be something that a hiring committee will not see on their resume or any other documentation. This is a very individual statement about the student that can only be given from another person. And then as well as the position description of the program or the position that they're applying to. It's useful to have this on hand because then you can use it to best assess and highlight what you know of the student and their abilities in relation to what the program or position are looking for in their applicant. That way you can touch on very specific details about what their leadership is, what their work ethic is in relation to what the company might be looking for. And also, if even off the student resume and the position description, you don't have enough information, like you don't feel like you have enough information to move forward, you can definitely look into the company or organization yourself. Otherwise, it's totally okay to ask the student to provide you information as well. Make them do a little digging, do a little background research for you. Ultimately, ask the student what you need to best set yourself up for success. And then, like I mentioned before, because I know that you'll all be working with students and individuals in all different capacities, other things that might be beneficial to ask for from students would be things like a personal essay. We know that's pretty big for grad schools, that students need to have a personal essay. If you want that as well, it could help you give a little more insight about the students' desires and goals. Say you have a high school student, their unofficial transcripts or their SAT, ACT score could be good, or just an overall portfolio. Sometimes there's some art students out there or marketing students, whatever kind of student that might be. Asking for a portfolio of some of their best work is also a great way to get insight on the kind of worker that the student is inside and outside of the classroom, in addition to your internship. All right. So once you've said yes, once you have what you need and you are just so comfortable, you're ready to go, you're like, I'm so excited to write a letter of recommendation for the student, we're gonna want to get into the nitty-gritty of the structure. So I'm going to separate this into 3 different categories of the structure after explaining, just the overview of the structure. So I'm going to talk about starting out, where I talk about how to start out the letter of recommendation, the supporting paragraphs where you get into the meat and the information about the student, and then how to close your letter of recommendation. So overall, although it sounds like I'm going to be talking about a lot, you really actually need to provide a little. And when I mean a little, not like just short words and generic phrases, you want to be able to state what you need to state in very clear and concise ways, because a letter of recommendation typically does not exceed 1 page. If it does, that is okay. Do not worry. It's not the end of the world. However, this is going to be sometimes hiring committees have a lot of applications to go through, so you want to make sure you're able to say it as sweet and simple and as unique as you can. In some sense, think of it as a cover letter, but for someone else. Much like I mentioned before, you don't want to state the obvious, and that means not taking what's on the resume and copy pasting, or taking and then like rephrasing it. They're going to be looking at the resume. You want this to be a unique document in and of itself. Another thing about the structure is you want to be candid and obvious, as well as speak on the positive attributes and intangibles of the student. So intangibles are things that are not like a set number, like ACT, SAT, stuff like that. The intangibles are things on, talking about their work ethic or talking about how they have shown leadership. Those are things that you can't just calculate on a calculator next to you. And always remember that as you're writing this, much like I mentioned before, because it is a professional document, your audience is going to be typically admission counselors or hiring committees and not a peer colleague. So you're going to want to be professional as well as, concise. So for starting out, the first section I'll talk about is starting out. And after this slide, when I talk through all of it, I will give specific examples. They are a little more generic than what you'd probably write yourself. However, they are good starting points. So starting out, you're going to want to address the letter, much like anything. So you'll want to add the date, add a space, do the address block of the recipient. And in this case, the recipient is the name or names that are listed on the position description. So if it says, write your letter of recommendations out to Stephanie Smith, then you're going to want to address Stephanie Smith, and that's who the address block will state. One big thing about letter of recommendations is a little different than some other professional documents is when you're addressing the letter, and I know it's such a small point, but it makes a big difference. You're going to want to use a colon instead of a comma. So it'd be like, Dear Stephanie Smith, colon, as opposed to Dear Stephanie Smith, comma. So definitely a little kind of like minute point to remember. And then I'll go into more depth about it in a different slide, but another example is to whom it may concern. More than likely, there's going to be at least one person to address this letter to. However, if there is absolutely no way to find any information about who this letter should be addressed to, it is okay to use to whom it may concern in that same fashion with a colon. So once all that's set up, that's sometimes the easiest part, really. You're going to want to go into the introduction or the first paragraph of it. This is going to be a paragraph that is dedicated to describing and establishing how you know the student, stating that this is a letter of recommendation, as well as providing your own credentials to whoever may be reading this document. So basically, the starting out is, who you are, what are you talking about, when, where, and why are you doing this. If you have troubles finding an address for who this is out to, again, you can ask the student to help you dig for that. And one big thing to remember is, even if there is a name stated for who to address it to, never assume the gender of the recipient. So instead of shortening like Dear Stephanie Smith to Dear Mrs. Stephanie Smith, you never want to assume that. So however they have the name listed is how you're going to want to put it in the letter as to not offend. Okay, so I'm going to go into an example of that address block. So on the left, you'll see I have the very generic, you put the date, add a space, you're going to put the recipient's name, their title, where they work, and then the address. And then another space, and you'll do the greeting as I discussed earlier. So on the right, I did put my own example. So say that you were writing a letter of recommendation for a student and I was receiving it. You'd put, today's date if you were writing it, Wednesday, June 17th. You'd put the name, title, all those good things. And I did mine as example since you guys know me, so it might be a little more easier to kind of connect the dots there. And then I'm going to, okay, so the next part is, in addition to that starting out, this is that intro paragraph where you kind of like state your credentials. Again, this is a very, very generic way to start it out, but still also a very valid one. So I'll just kind of read through it. You can say, it is my pleasure to recommend Jane Doe for the position of this position at your company. And then you want, so that'll be, okay, this is stating this is a letter of recommendation. The next part can be how you give your own credentials. So I am a co-founder of a nonprofit called this, which, and then if you would like, you can give a little brief description of what you do to further those credentials, or just to give a little insight about where you're coming from and what perspectives you have. And then finally, you want to talk about how you know the student. I came to know Jane when I was her supervisor while she's an intern for us in the spring of 2020. And the last two lines are kind of optional, or you can add these into the supporting paragraphs, which I'll go into next. But if you'd like to introduce a little bit more on the student very briefly, you could say something along the lines of her work comprised of, short description, and she distinguished herself by blank. Again, those last two aren't required, but if you wanted to kind of add that in there, you can. And by no means is the order in which this example on here is the only way to do it. However you feel that flow is for you, definitely find your own way. But again, if you wanted to use that example, it is there. Okay. So I'm going to go jump into the supporting paragraphs. So supporting paragraphs are kind of like, well, not kind of, this is the section where you will talk about the student in depth. So this is where you're going to introduce how long you've known the student and what capacity. I know you just did that in the intro paragraph. However, this will be a little more in depth. Like instead of just saying they work with me as an intern, you could do something along the lines of I've known the students for 6 months, and out of the time I've known them, they've shown great leadership in XYZ ways. Ultimately, in the supporting paragraphs, this is where you're going to connect the student and their qualifications and their abilities with the position description or program description that is provided to directly support student can do what you are asking, and here's an example of how I've seen it. And that brings me to, you're going to want to use specific examples to illustrate the abilities you state the student has. It is not good practice just to state that, Jane is a good leader and not explain why, because in that part is kind of just empty words. You're going to want to give it a little more, little more bump up. One thing you can do is talk comparatively. So talking about why you're impressed with the student, or even if you feel the need to for that particular individual, you can rank them in how you've interacted with other interns. So if Jane was such an extraordinary intern that she's left such an amazing impact on you as compared to other interns you've had come through, that's something also great to mention if that happens to be the feeling you have toward the student and their work. Much like I mentioned before, this is going to be where you want to talk about the intangibles. So speak to the student's aptitude, their depth of character, and their maturity level. Again, things that won't be on the resume, because those are typically just position descriptions or just details of what their duties were. Ultimately, you want to make sure that you describe how the student is fit for them, as well as how they're a good fit for the student. Because obviously, if the student's applying, they think they're a good fit too. Overall, you want to make sure that you have a balanced assessment on the student between their character and their interests. So for this part, we're actually going to skip to the closing paragraphs as opposed to going into examples, because we'll go into the examples later in the presentation, because there are so many different ways that you can go about doing this. And supporting paragraphs can be anywhere between 2 to 5, if not more, paragraphs long, depending on how you want to divide them up and talk about the student's qualifications. But again, still doing your best to keep it within one page. So we'll come back to that. So I'll just jump to the closing. Closing is going to be, very similar to what you would do on something like a cover letter. We're going to lightly recap the abilities that you have talked about, and just kind of furthering that discussion, but not bringing up any too new concepts, as well as stating that, if you'd like more information, please feel free to reach out to me. However, I'm going to give a best practice tip on that one. And I'll have it written out in the next slide, so don't worry about copying me word for word right now. But we do see a lot of people add at the end saying, please do not hesitate to contact me if you need additional information about the student. We recommend that you don't say that, because sometimes that can come across as, please call me, I have more to say that I don't want to put on paper. Sometimes that can actually shed a negative light on the students. So what we suggest is that you say something along the lines of, should you need more information, I would welcome an opportunity to provide additional details and support to my strong letter of recommendation for the student. Again, that'll be in the next slide. So yeah, that's just kind of I even saw that as new information when I was going through all this, so I was definitely like, oh, that's a great one. So once the closing statement's there, signing off is the easiest part. You just say, sincerely, leave a few spaces for your signature, whether you're going to do that digitally or you're actually going to sign off on it, and however you're going to send that. And then just your name in print, as well as a contact information for you. I typically just do my name, Rochelle Caston, and another space below it, I just put my email, because I feel like that's my best form of communication. And that's kind of how you close it off. And real quick, I do have an example of that. It's a little bit lengthy, so I'll read it if you want to follow along. So an example of a closing paragraph could be, Jane is unquestionably an exceptional candidate for your position. Jane's work at our organization suggests that she would be a great addition to the company's team. She has proven herself to have the perseverance, initiative, and intellectual creativity necessary to succeed in this role. So that's kind of culminating what you know and what you just talked about Jane Doe. Therefore, I would highly recommend Jane Doe. Her work ethic at this internship is a good indication of how she would perform at your position. She would be an extremely positive asset to your company. And then finally, much like I said in that recommendation of how a good way that you could also end is that should you need more information, I would welcome the opportunity to provide additional details and support to my strong recommendation for Jane. And then, sincerely, space, your name and contact information. All right, so um, just kind of wanted to do a really quick wrap up before we move into the uh, like the sorry the examples and the discussion. All of these are optional things you can do at the end. None of these are required. These are just things that we recommend. So, with being a partner in the Inclusive Internship Project, if you are going to be doing a letter of recommendation and you feel like you need someone to review it, but you don't know who to reach out to, definitely feel free to reach out to us. You can email me directly. I could give you the contact information for my supervisor, Sarah Hansen, who is the Director of Career Development. We'd love to review those for you if you have any questions or anything like that. Another thing you can do is if you hadn't already set a date with a student about when you are going to have this submitted by, definitely feel free to give them an update on when you did submit it, just to take that burden off their shoulder and that question. And then it's not required, but if you would like to provide the student a copy of your letter of recommendation, you are more than welcome to do that. Most students will ask, doesn't mean you have to give it to them. That's kind of up to your own comfort level. I know in my own personal experience, I've gotten about half of my letter recommendations back. And then finally, if you're a user of LinkedIn, or if you know the student is, you can also recommend or ask them if they would like you to adapt the letter of recommendation to add as a LinkedIn recommendation. If that's something that interests you, I'm not going to go into it in depth here because I do know people use LinkedIn in varying ways. But if you're interested in what that might look like, let's definitely connect after this some more, and I can get you some resources on what that could look like. I know that there's a lot of students in varying degrees that do use LinkedIn fairly often, so that could be beneficial depending on the individual. So, I want to take a pause here real quick to ask if any of you, after all of my talking there, I do apologize, if any of you had any questions or needed any clarifications or had any comments up to this point. You can either unmute yourself or you can put it down in the chat and then I can respond that way as well, verbally.
Hi, I have a couple of questions. They should be easy ones.
Yeah, no problem.
Do you ever, my company's in the habit of doing like a general recommendation letter. Is that something that you would recommend we continue to do? So like, just as the student leaves, here's a general letter that says how great you are.
I would strongly recommend against that
Okay.
because when it does come to a general letter of recommendation, I mean, you can touch on those pretty generic things like, they were a good student, they did ample work, stuff like that. However, much like I mentioned before, it doesn't talk about the student specifically. And it kind of doesn't, all students are going to come in with their own backgrounds and their own knowledge. And even you, being a supervisor to intern, would know that, one student's different than the other. So you don't want to take away from that opportunity to have their individualness shine through.
Okay.
So I would strongly recommend against that. I'm not saying change your whole process, but if there is a way for you, if you still needed to use a template, if there is a way for you to adapt it to have more room for change and maybe keep things like the intro and outro the same, but really those supporting paragraphs in the middle about the student themselves is going to be the most important part.
Thanks.
Yeah.
One other question is if, like, say there's an intern that is applying for a job that doesn't really relate to the work that he or she did, like for us, but they still ask for a letter of recommendation, would you recommend that we still write one like based on their character or work ethic, or would you recommend that we decline?
I think that'd be more personal preference on who is writing the letter of recommendation. It definitely is possible, even if they are in completely different realms of, say there's like a STEM student looking to go into like business, those are two completely different skill sets. However, what is going to stay consistent in an individual is their work ethic or, their leadership abilities or, just their overall sense of maturity. Those things are very what's that word I'm looking for? Like it's things that will cover a wider base. Maybe you wouldn't touch on like specific things like, oh, a student knows how to do a pivot table in Excel. That wouldn't make
Right.
sense for some places, but definitely it'd still be possible to talk about the student's attributes and intangibles.
Thank you.
Anna or Michael, did you happen to have any questions, or I'll go on to the examples?
I think we can go on. I think the directions you gave are actually quite good. I really like the way you added in the more information that to support the recommendation, because I think that takes away from any ambiguity as to what that means.
Right. Thank you on that. All right, so we're just going to jump to the examples real quick. I'll have a set of 5. There will be, basically, how it's going to go is I'll read the prompt to you. And again, whether you want to unmute yourself or put in the chat, you'll say if it's a good or a bad example, and then just kind of elaborate maybe a little bit on why you think it is good or bad. I wouldn't say there's no wrong answer. Some of them definitely are better than the others. But however you want to interpret these is your own. So we'll go on to the first example, and you can follow along as I read it. So example number 1 is, Charles is one of those interns who, at any moment, can be relied on to provide an extra hand in a project or to bounce ideas off of and receive genuine and thoughtful insight. He often applies what he has used in this degree to improve our process and provide fresh perspective on our work. Do you think this is a good or a bad example?
What's it for?
So this is
I
just.
think
Sorry.
I think it can be good, but it depends on what's being asked for.
Yes, you got it right on the dot there. So this is one of the ones I marked as good or bad. Thought I could trick you right from the get-go. Guess I can't. You guys learned enough, right? Oops, sorry. So yes, you were right. This is a good start, but then it does really depend on what is it being applied to in the position. The writer of this one could have put in could have added something along the lines of, he applies what he used in his degree to improve processes. Therefore, I think that he'd be a great candidate, or, whatever that might be that could be related to the position description. But overall, it does talk on the student's depth of character, such as he's genuine and insightful. And it implies that he's a deep thinker by saying, fresh perspective. But again, it could have gone a little further. All right, so example number 2, so you can follow along. Judy is a student body president as well as captain of girls lacrosse. She is very committed to both these activities alongside the work she does at our organization as an intern and the various other clubs she participates in on campus. I have been very impressed with her diligence and work ethic. Is this good or bad?
I'd say bad. She's too scattered.
Yeah, I think it's a little vague.
Again, right on the money there. This is not a good example. Much like you said, it's very vague. It leaves really no insight. And one thing about this one is it basically is just taking what she had on her resume and putting it into sentences by just kind of listing the position that she's been of. I mean, it does show that she has had leadership and that maybe she is a leader. However, it doesn't talk about how or why she's a leader. Also, because it's very vague in a general statement, it lacks enthusiasm or that multidimensionality that you want to get about a student, and there really isn't any insight or mention of qualifications. So good job on that one. All right, so we'll go to the next. This one is, James reported to me for one semester while working as an intern at our organization. He did a capable job in the areas that were expected of him and would often ask for additional work if he had time after successfully completing a required project. Good or bad?
I mean, it seems like there could be more information on what areas were expected of him. Not horrible.
I think it's terrible. My own personal weakness is I want people to come to me to say what's next, and if I have to tell them what's next, that doesn't work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this is not a good example. Much like the last one, it doesn't speak much on the student other than just kind of saying, he did what he needed to, and if he needed more work, he asked. However, much like you said, Michael, if a student needs to come to you asking for that, that might not talk so well on their initiative as an individual. Again, depending on how this person was trying to frame the student, it could have been framed a little different. But again, this is not a good example with it being too vague. All right, here is the fourth one. It's a little bit longer, so I'll be sure to read this one to you as well. So this one is, Kate's recent involvement in developing a new charitable organization within our nonprofit helped them to understand why politicians and philanthropists do what they do and helped them to realize how selfish they have been previously in being content to live in their little world with their own friends and family. This type of soul-searching, quiet reflection, and self-evaluation is impressive and well beyond their years. What do you guys think of this one?
I mean, it's kind of funny. Just because the little world part just seems a little sassy.
I think it depends on what she's looking for. If it's, we have a fairly socially conscious organization that probably would agree with some of those statements, but you'd have to know that she could control it, when she's working with people. I mean, this is fine to believe, but then you got to be polite.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, we've talked about this too, but just depending on where they're applying, that could influence the nature of the tone.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, sorry, I guess I should have prefaced that these are just kind of little snippets out of examples from letter of recommendation. I do realize maybe I should have given a little more context into who they were writing to. But you all are making great points about, depending on the context, this could be a good one, which it is. I'll let you know that one. This is one of those better examples. And the reason it is because it speaks to the students' depth of character. They are a very insightful individual. It talks about their maturity level, again, saying that they self-evaluate well beyond their years. It talks about what the student brings to the table, such as their heightened level of engagement, and implies that they're a deep thinker. One thing I did want to mention on the example is, if you noticed, the pronouns I used for the individual were they and them. That is something that's very important to be cognizant of when writing a letter of recommendation for a student, is to be cognizant of their own identity. Whether you're comfortable asking the student or if they've told you before, it is totally all right to ask just for confirmation on that, so you're representing the student accurately. And if at any time you do have a student that does not use the she, her, he, him of which you're used to, definitely do not hesitate to reach out to me or anyone in career development, because we'd love to help you through what that looks like when writing any kind of document for another individual. All right, so in the last one, it seems like y'all have a good grasp on these. This last one is a good example, so I'm just going to read it for you for one more example. But this one is, I've known Lucy for 3 years. She has interned for me in her college years, as well as a vet tech, and we have stayed in contact ever since. Lucy is a great girl with a true spark. She has great people and communication skills and is very well organized. My customers love her, and within a week, she knew all about our guests and their pets. If there was anything she could do to make the experience better, she would go out of her way to do it. And what I wasn't able to add into here was just, the example that was given for the experience that she did, as I didn't want to put too many words on the slide. But again, this is a really good example of how it does talk about how great of an individual the student has been. So to end this out, here we go. Here is a list of the references and the websites that I used. I apologize, they are not in APA format, but this is a little more easily accessible. And I'll be sure that within the next week, since this is the last session of the day, I will be sure to send out a video link to this whole session and a best tips practice sheet to look over, as well as these references in the case you needed more information or wanted to watch any of the videos I used for this. So in saying that, I want to give a huge thank you for you guys carving out this time in your day to listen in and, become involved in all of this. Is there anything that you have any questions on now or need any additional clarifications? We definitely have the time for that.
I'm good.
I think I'm good.
All right. Well, if that's it, thank you again for coming today. If anything comes up in the meantime, definitely feel free to reach out to me. If you have any of those letter recommendations coming through, feel free to send them our way for any reviews or edits if you feel comfortable to send that. Otherwise, I do hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.